I lost everything I had in one phone call, and the voice that took it sounded exactly like my grandson. What would you do if the person begging for help carried the same voice you once rocked to sleep? The same tone that used to call you grandpa with scraped knees and small secrets only the two of you shared. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 76 years old. And lately I have been learning that survival is not always about staying alive. Sometimes it is about enduring the humiliation of realizing you were fooled by love. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing dramatic about the light coming to the kitchen window. Nothing unusual about the quiet in the house. I had been organizing old documents, preparing things for a future that feels closer every year. When the phone rang, I answered without hesitation. I had no reason to be suspicious. The voice sounded distressed, breathless, frightened. It carried urgency and familiarity at the same time. Within seconds, it identified itself as my grandson and described an accident, legal trouble, consequences that could stain his future permanently. The story unfolded quickly. Then another voice entered the call, calm and professional, presenting itself as someone trying to resolve a private crisis before it escalated. Details were shared, personal ones, specific ones. Enough truth woven into the urgency to remove doubt. Enough fear layered into the request to override logic. I was told that time was critical, that if funds were transferred immediately, everything could remain discreet. I was urged not to involve his parents to avoid panic and long-term damage. I was made to feel that I alone could fix this. And that is how they wounded me, because they did not threaten me. They appealed to responsibility, to pride, to the lifelong instinct to protect your blood. If stories like this matter to you, and if you believe voices like mine deserve to be heard, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps this space grow and allows more stories of people over 50 to reach those who might need them before it is too late. I went to the bank with trembling hands and a racing heart. I did not verify the story. I did not call anyone else. I acted on instinct, on fear, on love. I transferred the money that represented 45 years of labor, overtime shifts, deferred vacations, quiet sacrifices no one remembers except the one who made them. It was my security, my dignity, my final layer of independence. Within minutes, it was gone. When I returned home, the silence fell heavier. There was no real confirmation beyond a brief acknowledgement that the transfer had been received. Something inside me began to fracture, but I told myself it was shock. I told myself he would call once everything was resolved. Instead, when I contacted my real grandson later that day, I discovered he was safe, calm, unaware, living an ordinary afternoon untouched by police, courtrooms, or fear. That was the moment the truth settled in. There had been no accident, no emergency, no crisis, only a stranger who had learned how to sound like someone I love. By the time I contacted the bank, the funds had already moved beyond recovery. The authorities used phrases like digital fraud, voice cloning, targeted elder scams. They explained that technology now allows criminals to replicate tone, pacing, even emotional inflection. They spoke clinically, as if describing a weather pattern. But this was not weather, because what they stole was not just money. They stole the years I spent building it. They stole the confidence I had in my own judgment. They stole the simple belief that when I hear my grandson's voice, it is truly him. And that is something I still do not know how to recover. The first night after it happened, I did not sleep. I sat in the same chair where I had answered the phone and tried to reconstruct the moment where I should have known. I replayed the tone of the voice in my mind, the tremor, the urgency, the fragile vulnerability that made me move without thinking. I searched for a crack in illusion, a hesitation, something artificial that I could have detected. But memory is cruel when it wants to be. It reshapes itself to protect us, and sometimes to accuse us. By morning, the shame had settled deeper than the financial loss. The money was measurable. It had numbers, statements, transaction codes. The shame did not. It moved silently through my chest and into my thoughts. It whispered that I had been naive, that at 76 years old, I should have known better. That experience is supposed to make a man cautious, not careless. When I contacted the bank again, they explained that these crimes are designed precisely for people like me, people with savings, people with grandchildren, people whose greatest fear is failing their family. They told me the technology can replicate voices from seconds of audio found online, a birthday video, a social media clip, a voicemail recording. That is all it takes now to manufacture familiarity. I listened, but I did not fully absorb it, because the part that haunted me was not the technology. It was the moment I felt useful. For those few minutes on that call, I was not an aging widower managing medication schedules and medical appointments. I was needed. I was the solution. I was the one person who could prevent disaster. They gave me urgency, but they also gave me purpose. And I responded to that faster than I responded to fear. That realization hurt more than the transaction itself. Later that week, I told my daughter. Her face shifted to confusion, anger, and then something softer that tried to hide itself. Concern. Pity. She said I should have called her first. She said I cannot handle these things alone anymore. She said the world is different now. Different is a gentle word. What she meant was that the world has become sharp and I have become slow. I began noticing small changes in how people spoke to me after that. Explanations became simpler. Decisions were double-checked. Offers to help manage. My account appeared in careful conversations. No one said the word incapable, but it hovered between sentences. I had spent my entire adult life being the one others leaned on. I fixed broken appliances. I handled paperwork. I understood contracts. I was steady, reliable, rational. Now I was the cautionary example. Friends from church told me similar stories. Once I gathered the courage to admit mine. A woman who lost her retirement to someone pretending to be her granddaughter. A man who wired money overseas because he believed his son was stranded. The pattern was always the same. A familiar voice. A crisis. Urgency. Isolation. Transfer. We all said the same sentence afterward. I never thought it could happen to me. And yet it did. The police report sits in a folder on my desk, stamped and documented. It offers the illusion of action. But paper does not restore trust. It does not quiet the question that keeps circling my mind. If I could not recognize the difference between my grandson's real voice and a manufactured one, what else might I fail to recognize as I grow older? That fear is not about money. It is about erosion, about the possibility that the world is advancing faster than my ability to understand it, about the quiet suspicion that one day I might doubt my own senses again. I still hear that voice sometimes when the house is silent. Not clearly, not distinctly, but enough to remember how easily I believed it. And what troubles me most is this. They did not break into my home. They did not force my hand. They simply understood my love better than I understood their deception. And that is a vulnerability I do not know how to fortify. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to routine as if routine could restore balance. I paid my remaining bills on time. I watered the plants. I attended Sunday service. From the outside, nothing dramatic had changed. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer trusted the ordinary. Every phone call carried suspicion. Every unknown number felt like a potential trap. Even familiar voices caused a brief pause in my chest before recognition settled in. I began studying tone, pacing, breathing patterns, as if I could train myself to detect artificiality. I researched voice synthesis late into the night, reading about algorithms that learn cadence and inflection. The explanations were technical, almost elegant. The technology itself was not evil. It was simply powerful. What frightened me was how accessible that power had become. I learned that scammers often target older adults because we are statistically more likely to have savings and less likely to question authority during urgent situations. I learned that criminals rehearse scripts built around emotional triggers: fear, secrecy, urgency, shame. They isolate the victim from verification and create a narrow window of action. Every psychological step is deliberate, and I walked through each one exactly as planned. That knowledge did not comfort me. It made the experience feel engineered, calculated, clinical, as if my humanity had been reduced to predictable variables in a behavioral equation. There's something profoundly destabilizing about realizing your instincts can be manipulated. For decades, I believed that love sharpened perception, that caring deeply for someone made you more attuned to them. Now I understood that the same attachment can be weaponized. Around the third week, I began noticing a different kind of silence in my house. It was not just the absence of my wife, which I had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a silence shaped by caution. I stopped answering unknown numbers altogether. I let calls go to voicemail. I waited for confirmation before engaging with anything remotely urgent. In protecting myself, I also distanced myself. My grandson called one evening to ask about a school project. His real voice, warm and familiar, filled the receiver. Yet even then, I felt a subtle hesitation before responding. It lasted only a second, but I felt it. A tiny fracture where trust used to be seamless. That is when I realized the theft had expanded beyond finances. They had introduced doubt into a relationship that had never known it. And doubt, once planted, does not disappear easily. It lingers. It waits. It questions. I began avoiding conversations about the loss because each retelling reopened the wound. People offered reassurance. They said it was not my fault. They reminded me that professionals are deceived too. But reassurance does not erase self-reproach. It does not quiet the image of myself standing at the bank counter, signing away my security with steady hands. The amount I transferred represented my contingency plan for aging with independence. It was the margin that allowed me to believe I would not become a burden. With it gone, practical adjustments became necessary. Budget revisions, lifestyle reductions, quiet calculations about longevity and health care. There is a specific humiliation in revising your future downward. It forces you to confront vulnerability in tangible terms. The fraud was not just an emotional blow. It was a structural one. It altered the architecture of my remaining years. Around that time, I found myself staring at an old photograph of my grandson as a child, sitting on my shoulders at a county fair. His laughter in that picture is open, unguarded. The trust in his eyes is uncomplicated. I realized that what I responded on that phone call was not simply a voice. It was memory. It was history. It was the echo of a lifetime of shared moments. Technology replicated the sound, but it was my own recollections that completed the illusion. And that realization cut deeper than any technical explanation ever could, because it means the deception did not only come from outside, it came from inside me as well. Around the fourth week, something else began to surface beneath the anger and humiliation. It was not immediate, and it did not arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly, like condensation forming on glass. It was grief, not grief for the money alone, although that loss remained real and heavy. It was grief for the version of the world I had believed in, the version where a familiar voice meant safety, where technology was a convenience, not a weapon, where age brought wisdom that shielded you from certain mistakes. I had believed that growing older meant becoming harder to deceive. That experience built armor. Instead, I discovered that experience builds attachments. And attachments are openings. That was the beginning of the metaphor I did not want to face. I started thinking of trust as a house I had spent decades constructing, brick by brick, routine by routine, conversation by conversation. Each family memory another layer of insulation against loneliness and uncertainty. The phone call did not burn that house down. It did something more unsettling. It revealed that one of the doors had never truly been locked. Not because I was careless, because I never imagined someone would try that door. When I walked through my living room at night, the space felt different. The furniture had not moved. The photographs were still aligned along the hallway, but something invisible had shifted. I no longer assumed safety simply because the environment was familiar. I checked locks twice. I reviewed bank statements repeatedly. I questioned emails that once would seem harmless. Hypervigilance replaced ease, and hypervigilance is exhausting. There were moments when I felt anger toward the criminals. Sharp, immediate anger that imagined them as faceless operators in distant rooms, studying vulnerability like a market strategy. But anger fades. What remained was something heavier and more persistent. Embarrassment. I replayed the day at the bank countless times. The teller's brief hesitation. The form sliding across the counter. My signature at the bottom. I wondered if she suspected anything, if she saw something in my expression that hinted at urgency beyond reason, if she debated intervening more forcefully. And I wondered whether pride prevented me from appearing uncertain. That thought unsettled me, because pride has always been part of my identity, providing for my family, making responsible decisions, being composed in crises. The scam exploited fear, yes, but it also exploited that pride. The suggestion that I alone could solve the problem appealed to something deep and unexamined. I was not just protecting my grandson. I was protecting my image of myself. That is what made the loss more complex. It was not a simple act of deception. It was a carefully structured narrative designed to align with my values: responsibility, discretion, loyalty. They constructed a story in which acting quickly felt noble, and I stepped into it willingly. One evening, as I sat alone at the kitchen table again, I realized something that unsettled me further. If I had hesitated longer, if I had paused to verify, part of me would have felt guilty for doubting my grandson. The scam relied on that internal conflict. It relied on my reluctance to question someone I love. Love became leverage. That sentence stayed with me. It forced me to examine how many other areas of my life operate on similar assumptions. How often do I trust because I want to believe? How often do I accept information because it aligns with my hopes? The house of trust one built over decades was still standing, but now I saw its vulnerabilities: the windows, the unlocked doors, the places where familiarity substitutes for verification. And once you see those vulnerabilities, you cannot unsee them. That awareness is both protective and isolating, because safety, I am learning, sometimes comes at the cost of innocence. After a month, the practical consequences began to settle into numbers instead of shock. I met with a financial advisor for the first time in my life, not because I want to grow wealth, but because I needed to preserve what remained. We reviewed expenses line by line, subscriptions canceled, travel postponed, renovations abandoned. The margins tightened quietly. No one announces when independence shrinks. It happens in adjustments. I began calculating years differently, not in birthdays, but in sustainability. How long could my remaining savings stretch if medical costs increased? What if I needed assisted care earlier than expected? What if inflation rose again? The fraud had introduced uncertainty into timelines I once believed were stable. There is a particular fear that comes with aging and finances. It is not greed. It is not luxury. It is the fear of becoming dependent. The fear of needing help you once provided to others. The money I lost was not excess. It was insulation against that fear. Without it, I felt closer to vulnerability than I ever had before. At family gatherings, I noticed myself observing rather than participating. Conversations about technology, artificial intelligence, and digital convenience now carried a different tone in my mind. When younger relatives joked about how easy it is to mimic voices or create realistic videos, I did not laugh. I thought about the moment my hands shook over a bank counter. I also began watching my grandson differently, though I tried not to show it, not with suspicion of him, but with awareness of how exposed his generation is online. Videos, voice clips, social media stories. Every shared moment is potential raw material for someone with malicious intent. The world encourages constant sharing. The criminals harvest it. That thought unsettled me deeply. One afternoon, I sat alone in the backyard, staring at the small garden my wife once cared for. The soil had hardened slightly from neglect. I realized I had stopped tending it since the call. It felt symbolic in a way I could not ignore. When trust is shaken, attention shifts inward. External care becomes secondary. I picked up a watering can and stood there longer than necessary, thinking about roots. Roots are invisible once planted. You trust they are holding the plant upright, even when you cannot see them. Trust in family works the same way. You do not test it constantly. You assume it is there, anchoring everything. The scammers did not cut my roots. They convinced me they were calling from them. That is the part that still unsettles me. The loss also altered how I perceived aging itself. I had always believed that vulnerability in old age came primarily from physical decline, slower reflexes, weaker muscles, fading eyesight. I did not anticipate cognitive vulnerability shaped by evolving technology. I did not anticipate that my strongest emotional bonds could become points of entry. And perhaps that is what hurts most. Not that I was tricked, but that the trick worked because I love deeply. When I try to forgive myself, I remind myself of that. I remind myself that my response was not stupidity. It was attachment. It was instinct shaped by decades of care. Yet forgiveness is not automatic. It requires repetition. Some nights I still lie awake thinking about that first sentence I heard on the phone. How natural it sounded. How quickly my body responded before my mind could analyze. The memory no longer burns as sharply, but it lingers like a scar you notice when weather changes. I have started speaking openly about the experience now. At church, at community meetings. I describe how convincing it was. How specific, how urgent. I tell others to verify first, to call back using no numbers, to pause before transferring anything. I speak slowly and clearly, not from authority, but from consequence. If my mistake can interrupt someone else's impulse, perhaps it regains some meaning. Perhaps that is how dignity returns, not through recovered money, but through warning. Speaking publicly about what happened did not erase the loss, but it shifted something inside me. The first time I stood in front of a small group at the community center and described call, my voice felt unsteady, not because I was reliving the event, but because I was confronting the last layer of shame. Silence protects pride. Speaking exposes it. Yet as I continued, I saw recognition in their faces. Not judgment, recognition. Heads nodded slowly. Eyes lowered. A few people avoided looking directly at me, as if my story had brushed too close to their own fears. Afterward, two men approached me separately and admitted they had received similar calls. One had almost transferred money but hesitated at the last second. The other had ignored the call entirely, assuming it was a scam, but later spent the entire evening worrying that it might have been real. That detail struck me. Even when we resist, they leave residue. The emotional architecture of these scams does not rely solely on success. It relies on destabilization, on planting uncertainty in the space where confidence used to live. I began to understand that what happened to me was not an isolated crime. It was part of a larger shift in how trust functions in modern life. We once relied on physical proximity and familiar voices as verification. Now those markers can be manufactured. Authenticity is no longer guaranteed by sound or appearance. This realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable about aging. It is not just the body that struggles to keep pace with change. It is the assumptions, the mental shortcuts built over decades. When I was younger, urgency combined with familiarity signaled authenticity. Today, that same combination can signal manipulation. The rules evolved quietly. I did not. There were moments when I resented that, when I felt left behind by a world that moves faster each year. But resentment is a heavy companion, and I have carried enough weight already. Instead, I chose something quieter. Adaptation. I set up verbal code words with my family for emergencies. I reduced public sharing of personal details. I enrolled in a local workshop about digital safety for seniors. I asked questions without pretending I already knew the answers. Humility can feel like surrender at first. Eventually, it feels like maintenance. Still, adaptation does not restore innocence. I noticed a change in myself when the phone rings unexpectedly. There's always a fractional pause now, a silent evaluation, a mental checklist. That pause protects me, but it also reminds me of what was taken. Ease, the simplicity of answering without suspicion. One evening, I asked myself whether I would undo the experience if I could. The answer came faster than I expected. Yes, without hesitation. I would choose ignorance over this lesson if given the chance. But the choice does not exist. So I am left with a different question. What does it mean to grow older in a world where deception grows more sophisticated each year? How do we preserve tenderness without becoming targets? How do we love fully without allowing love to be exploited? These are not technical questions. They are moral ones. Because beneath the technology, beneath the scripts and algorithms, there is still a human decision to harm another human for profit. And that decision is what unsettles me most. not the artificial voice, but the real one behind it. In the months since the call, the numbers have stopped echoing in my mind as loudly as they once did. The exact amount I lost no longer wakes me at 3 a.m. What remains is quieter, but heavier. It is the awareness that trust now requires effort. I used to believe that age simplified life, that once the rush of career and responsibility slowed, what remained would be clarity, fewer risks, fewer surprises, a narrowing world that felt safer because it was familiar. I was wrong. The world did not narrow. It transformed. I still sit at the same kitchen table most afternoons. The light still falls across the surface in the same way. But I notice details differently now. I notice how silence carries memory. I notice how quickly my mind scans for potential threat. I notice how often I rehearse conversations in my head before they happen. Hyper-awareness has replaced assumption. Sometimes I ask myself whether the criminals think about the people they target after the transaction clears. Do they imagine the quiet kitchen tables, the bank statements reviewed with trembling hands, the recalculated budgets and postponed medical procedures? Or are we simply data points? Successful extractions in a ledger? That question lingers because it forces me to confront something larger than my own loss. What kind of society are we becoming when technology can replicate affection, urgency, even vulnerability? When the sound of a loved one can be simulated convincingly enough to bypass decades of shared history? I have come to accept that I cannot return to who I was before the call. That version of me answered instinctively. He trusted without hesitation. He believed that familiarity equaled authenticity. This version of me pauses. And yet, despite everything, I refuse to let caution harden into bitterness. I still answer when my grandson calls. I still listen to his stories. I still attend his school events. The difference is subtle but permanent. Trust is no longer automatic. It is chosen consciously. Perhaps that is a final lesson. Not that love makes us weak, but that love without verification can be redirected by those who understand its power. If this story touched you in any way, or if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard before someone else learns the same lesson the hard way, consider subscribing to Emotional Life Tales, Voices After 50, and enabling notifications. Every new journey we share is another reminder that aging carries wisdom, even when that wisdom is born from pain. Now, let me ask you something. If the phone rang tomorrow and the voice sounded exactly like someone you love, would you pause? Would you verify? Or would you move as quickly as I did, guided by instinct and fear? Before you answer, remember this. I believed I was protecting my grandson. In reality, I was protecting an illusion. If you were in my place, hearing that voice, feeling that urgency, carrying decades of memory in your chest, would you have done anything differently? And if you would have paused, what would have given you the strength to do so?